Good evening, everyone. Thank you for showing up to this session on migration. I'm very happy to be here in Belgrade, and I would like to thank the organizers for putting together such a high-profile panel to discuss the issues before us. I think we have a lot of questions to go through, and I think a lot of them have been spelled out or at least alluded to in the background materials. Tonight we're going to discuss a crisis of values or management, migration in 2017. And there's so many things already packed into this title that I'm tempted to just go on talking, but that's not my role because I'm here to moderate this session. And I'm very happy that we have with us Tina Szabados, who's the director for Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia at the International Organization for Migration in Vienna. I would like to start, Tina, by asking you about the sort of extraordinary scenes we saw in 2015-16. It already feels like such a long time ago, of hundreds of thousands of desperate, destitute people making their way around here, through the Balkans, the Western Balkans, in search of protection or perhaps just a better life. The scenes of outpouring of public sympathy we saw on their arrival in places such as Munich. The extraordinary sight of EU member state police being deployed to a non-member state to guard its borders against refugees coming into the European Union from a European Union member state. And of course, also the spectacle, perhaps, of a European Union that really was having, in my view, kind of a nervous breakdown, really, over the arrival of so many refugees. Was this really a crisis of a new kind? Was this unprecedented?
Thank you so much for the question, and good evening to you all. Migration, as we all know, it's a reality. If it's in higher numbers or lower numbers, it still exists, and it's going to be existing. It's not a new phenomenon. It has always existed. Now, as you have been rightly mentioned, 2015 has been extraordinary because of the higher number. So they were not coming individually, but they were coming in big groups, not small groups, but quite big ones. I'm very glad that you have mentioned Munich, because indeed it has been a historical moment. I've been there in Munich at that time. I've been the chief of mission in Germany, so I could my own self experience this historical moment of people embracing migration. It has been unique because you would hear in the news all the time that they are against and no one wants and so on and so forth, while the people, the common people, will wait at the airport and will greet them with toys and food and so on and so forth. We can even speak about Hungary, actually my own country. At that point in time, while the fences were not on, but they already thought about building them, at that time already the people were there at the railway stations and really providing with food and humanitarian aid and whatever else was needed. So somehow this didn't come through the press. I think you would agree with me, because somehow the good story is not a good story enough, because only bad stories are good stories. And I think there it's probably a lack of education in terms of media and exposure, and to keep a very good balance. But apart from that, if we want to be very negative, we can really be very critical and say that it has been really a crisis, because the avalanche of people no one could deal with. It has been also extraordinary, as you were rightly pointing out, because these people were marching through EU member states. So it was a group marching from Hungary, not good enough, then let's go to Austria, not good enough, we won't stay, and all of them were aiming to get into Germany. In Germany, of course, after the avalanche arrived, it has been a little bit of hiccups because no one has been really prepared to deal with such a high number of people. But apart from all the criticism and everything else, today we can say that only last year, for example, 700 people were given protection out of 1.5 million. I think it's extraordinary. Take into consideration the previous year's numbers. Take into consideration Western Balkan routes. What the Western Balkan countries were doing in order to support these migrants is also exceptionally. In any case, migration should be seen obviously more as an opportunity than a challenge. It should be only merely a challenge. Sometimes it's also a responsibility, in particular protection of migrants, but of refugees. But in general, it should be seen as an opportunity. And this is the toxic narrative that we all hear from, particularly the media or the politicians, which we should get a turn on. Thank you.
Kilian, Kleinschmidt, you're an international humanitarian refugee expert with more than 25 years, according to the materials I've been given, of experience. What should we learn? What should we have learned? What is there to learn from the experience of the last few years?
Well, thank you. Good evening. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to value the people who dared to come via these very difficult and dangerous routes to us. They have been actually a change maker. They have been critical to understand for ourselves that we do have problems in our own societies. They have been the shock therapy we needed to understand that a large portion of our own population has been left behind. That there are very big issues of division within what we thought to be wonderland and rich countries with no problems. We do have poverty. We do have problems of people not getting the connection to this modern world of the 21st century. That's what we're seeing. Secondly, I think very crucial was for us to wake up to understand that Europe is not that united, that we changed the European project from what it was originally, a peace project, a dream which the founders of Europe actually had in mind of creating an open space where there would be no conflict any longer. The first time a generation born into peace, retiring into peace, that is something European citizens have forgotten, and that is, I think, something which is now to be revived. Thirdly, and this is, I think, for me, as being the so-called expert and aid worker by passion, having been out there in the field for 25 years and so on, they brought to us a message of saying, people, it doesn't work. A little bit of charity, giving back to what you are taking, and of unjust distribution of resources in this world is not enough any longer. This world has come together, it is globalized, it is interconnected, so now we are with you. So I think that is a number of lessons brought by a couple of million people to us. It continues. What is now very important, and I just did some work with the Austrian government in the last couple of months on looking into the African perspective, which is right now sort of the horror vision everybody draws on the walls and saying, my God, they're all coming. And you're getting these calls from people saying, Mr. Kleinschmidt, how can we prevent the Africans to make more babies, and so on, the root causes of displacement. And let's be honest, I mean, again, here we are realizing, or should be realizing, that the real challenge in terms of people on the move and all its facets of people on the move is elsewhere. We don't have a problem. When we're dealing easily with 650 million tourists coming to Europe a year, and so on. So it's not the 150,000 people who who came across the Mediterranean who are a threat to us, or shouldn't be a threat. We want to make it a threat. We want to have a problem. This is, it seems, the real issue. No, we need to now change the storytelling, the narrative, look into the ways of how other parts of the world can be dealing with the challenges of climate change, of population growth, which is also, let's be honest, linked to better health and other things, urbanization, moving forward in the real challenges of the 21st century. It's not the people on the move as such, it's the other challenges. Thank you.
I would perhaps like to add another facet to our debate by focusing more on the question of the extent to which this crisis has engaged European values, or what we think of European values. Ahmet, Evin, you're founding dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sabanci University in Istanbul. Europe, can it stay true to its values in managing immigration, in accepting refugees, in dealing with these perhaps unprecedented flows?
Thank you for the question. I'm not so sure that I'll be able to answer that question. It is a very difficult question, but let me also thank the organizers. I'm very happy to be here again on the Belgrade Security Forum, where we try to approach questions that are also changing. So let me start with a basic complexity of this, in the sense that one of the difficulties of approaching this question is that there are too many independent variables. This is what we really consider an unstructured problem. So in a way, we might say that on the one hand, we talk about the humanitarian values. On the other hand, there is a perception that the migrants and refugees pose a threat to these values, and since particularly the 2 years ago, the 2015 crisis, we have there was a perception in Europe that the perception of the migrants have changed from intruders to threat to European values, particularly what we heard about what happened New Year's Eve in Cologne and so on. Now, this may be perception, but it is a reality for a lot of people, so we have to take that into consideration. If they are the real threat to the very values according to which we are obliged to treat them, then we come to the central irony of this question that we cannot dismiss. Can one transgress one's values in order to save them, or at least thinking that they are saving them from the assault of others? That is one of the central dilemmas of this question. There is another independent variable that is connected to another question there, which I'm not going to delve into now, but it is about socializing the immigrants to European values. I have spent a fair amount, decades of my intellectual life, from my dissertation on, as to whether values were transferable across cultures. Any questions later, I'd be happy to debate with you. But let me come to 2 points. I implied that values, European values, face the danger of becoming irrelevant when fighting against those intruders. I mean, which one is more important? And that is the essential distinction that we have. Is Europe moving right-wing because of the reaction? But the point is that the values that we're trying to defend, that we think that they're under assault, creates a kind of reaction as we see in the electoral developments, and we cannot ignore that. Now, another question that I want to address very, very briefly is that is this a humanitarian or a political crisis? Well, it is both, but it is a humanitarian crisis that ends up being a political crisis. But we should also take into consideration in that particular context that this is a crisis that needs very careful management, and politicians are not equipped to execute careful management. The role of the politicians here is not to manage the crisis. The role of the politicians, by definition actually, in my trade, so to speak, is that politicians identify and direct resources according to the magnitude of the problem. Let me make, if I may, two concrete and rather maybe radical suggestions. Have we learned anything from the past experience? Maybe we should remember the experience of about 60 years ago. What about immigrant populations in Europe that are now, for example, resisting integration, but this is the third generation that is really resisting integration? Germany basically thought that by getting Gastarbeiter, these Gastarbeiter would go away. Well, they didn't. They were just about moving away, actually, when Turkey started growing at a very rapid rate, but that was a very short period, so they are not moving away either. But we can take away some lesson from that in the sense that one would hope and think logically that the wars in the Middle East will come to an end. Maybe later than sooner, but they will have to come to an end. And at that time, there will be a requirement for native labor to do the reconstruction there. So, in a way, we should also keep in mind that Europe, if managed properly, will not be overrun, but will be able to give better education for the people who will go back for the reconstruction. Maybe not in my lifetime, I don't expect it in my lifetime, but sometime. The other point that I want to bring, and I don't have time to elaborate, and there could be discussion later, that I mentioned the difficulty of approaching unstructured problems. Unstructured problems may defy solutions. They certainly defy simple solutions. But there's a way of approaching unstructured problems by a methodology called the search conference methodology, where you bring the stakeholders, sets of stakeholders, together to generate a common understanding of issues, not agreement, a common understanding of issues, so that we can move to the next stage of listing those issues and have another stakeholder meeting with different stakeholders to identify what has to be done first. In other words, sequencing the way in which you address the issues. This is usually done for very large corporations, sometimes municipalities, and so on. This is huge, but it may be worth a try simply because we're not going to find a solution for these in the next 5, 10 years, 15 years or more. It might be well worth it to keep stakeholders of different opinions in some sort of an exchange and debate to be able to bring together a common understanding of what this is all about. Thank you.
Right. Our last speaker is Rosa Balfour. She's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US and acting director of... No longer. Are you director of the Euro program?
Okay. I was acting, and it had a time limit.
Rosa, I know that you've been doing some work on polling and things like that. Has this unprecedented influx of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants prompted new levels of hostility towards foreigners in Europe? What has this done?
Yes, no, thank you very much for this question, because I've been looking at, I've been doing some research on public opinion and how it affects foreign policy in Europe. And being given that immigration is a divisive topic in public opinion, I was trying to look at how opinions have changed, how attitudes have changed. And there is, from more than one source, European Social Survey, Eurobarometer, there actually is quite a bit of continuity in European attitudes towards immigration. And certainly during the period 2014, 2016, there was no peak in anti-immigration sentiment. So the dominant narrative that politicians have been giving us, actually, that we have our hands tied because public opinion doesn't want us to address this issue more comprehensively. We need to strengthen the external border because that is what public opinion is asking us to do. We've got elections next month, in 2 months' time, 3 months' time. I mean, we're always in election season. Actually, that is a narrative which can be contested by the data. Now, this is not to, I don't want to underestimate the issue. There is a majority of Europeans who are pretty hostile to immigration as a general attitude.
A majority, you said?
There is a majority, but that majority is shrinking. Now, it's probably because of young people entering into being polled, and maybe young people are more favorable to immigration, and we don't know whether they remain favorable when they grow older. So we don't actually know whether this is something that is going to evolve because new people are entering, or if these people are going to become more conservative when they grow older. This is something that we don't actually know. However, it is, I think, some important data to counter the dominant narrative. So what we've really seen is not so much public opinion shaping choices, but certain politicians, groups of political parties manipulating this evidence to pursue their own political agenda. And this has been fairly successful, I would say, because it's not just extreme right-wing, nativist, nationalist, xenophobic parties that have embracing this anti-immigration agenda and calling for, the chaos, accusing the chaos in Europe, blaming all the politicians for the chaos and the liberal values for the chaos in Europe. It's not just them, it's a bit broader than that. It has also been mainstream political parties and governments which have embraced this rhetoric. So as a consequence of this, and we can see the consequences on the policies and how they are being outlined. I mean, I guess we'll be talking about this a little bit later, but we can see the consequences of this in the policy choices that are being made and in the ways in which Europe is shaping future immigration policies, external relations in general, and foreign policy. We can see that this is having an impact, and that's something I think we need to look at. Having said this, and just to reiterate and go back to the point about values, I really think we should not underestimate, and we've seen it maybe more anecdotally, but I think we should perhaps look at these phenomena more carefully in the wake of Trump, in the wake of Brexit, in the wake of the refugee influx. Thousands of citizens have mobilized to support those values upon which the EU has embraced. They're not EU values, actually. Most of them are universal values which the EU has decided to embrace. And these people have not had sufficient voice. So I think when we talk about the fears of European publics or the sort of turn towards the right, etc., we really need to think about engaging more with those who disagree with this and have started to be much more vocal about it and work with those people if we want to build policies which are forward-looking and not backward-looking.
Rosa, just like you, I've been living in Brussels for a number of years, and what strikes me in the current debate, really, policy debate in Brussels, is that there was this frantic pace of initiatives, measures, activities, statements for a while, and then it sort of died down, and I feel we're now back a little bit. Perhaps complacency is too strong a word, but there's a bit of a feeling that the worst is behind us. Because yes, numbers are up on the central Mediterranean route, but that's very much seen as a sort of a Libya problem, much more than a general European problem, the way the Balkan route was seen. Is that the impression you're getting as well? And if so, is that actually true? Is the worst behind us?
I mean, I think in terms of headlines, yes, but actually I've been looking at migration policy, and the number of documents that are churned out by the institutions it's impossible to keep on top of everything. And I think what's happening here is, no, you're right about focusing very much on the Libya question, which is, after all, Italy tries to save these people. They've been doing it for 25 years. The rest of Europe has pretended that the problem didn't exist for 25 years. And dirty deals with the Libyans or other nasty governments have been done in the past they did dirty deals with Gaddafi, basically. But, dirty deals have been done. So it's not attracting that much attention. But I think there's something else is also going on. And that's really where things are going to get. At some point, I think the member states and the EU needs to come clean about what's happening. There always are two dimensions to migration policy. One is internal, and the other one is external. On the internal front, everybody says we need to have a common asylum policy. Nothing is happening there. Nothing is happening as far as allowing legal channels for immigration. These areas, this is not my field of expertise, but I keep on checking in with my colleagues. Is anything happening? No. On the external front, a lot is happening, and this is quite interesting, but I think it's a bit of a game of smoke and mirrors. What is happening is that the member states want the EU to get deals with third countries. They want the EU to reach migration compacts and new partnership frameworks with third countries, which are basically focused on keeping the people out of Europe. And this is the ask from the member states. Now, of course, the member states are not putting a penny into this, okay? They want to use existing resources, and that is an issue because it's going to eat into development aid, sustainable development goals, aid for sustainable development goals. I mean, we'll have to see. And the next budget negotiations are going to tell us what's going on that front. But the way this is all framed, rather than going to Nigeria to say, right, let's work together to see how Nigeria can address climate change, urbanization, population growth, education, build skills. Let's do this with a big comprehensive package, which also has money attached to it. And then maybe Nigeria will start to listen to the requests of Europeans to start taking irregular migrants back, because that's the trade-off that is being offered. The problem is what the EU has to put on the table is not very much. So ultimately, and this is my suspicion, the member states will turn to the EU and say, look, you failed on this. You weren't able to reach readmission agreements with third countries. The situation is the same. And therefore, you shouldn't be competent. We're going to renationalize powers, to the EU or whatever conclusions they're going to draw from this. So it's a bit of a poisoned chalice. On the one hand, it's a positive development that the member states start to think about mobility and migration in more global terms, and therefore for foreign policy to play a role in that. On the other hand, if it's not done properly and without any resources, it's going to fall flat on its face, and then it's going to be the EU which is going to take the blame for it.
Tina, about this whole issue of, you know, have we seen the peak? Is the crisis over? What's happening now? I mean, what's your take on it? Is what we're seeing today in in the fall of 2017 a continuation of the sort of peak, the crisis years of 2015-16, or is this a new issue that requires calls for new kinds of approaches?
It is definitely a continuity of a discussion. You can call it a crisis, you can call it a turmoil, you can call it a perfect storm, or a challenge, or a problem, or an opportunity. And I can't wait to hear the opportunity being heard more often, actually. But all in all, before doing anything, I think that the press and media and all of us researchers and experts were speaking so much about it during these 2 years, more than ever before. I used to say that in the past, once a week migration was a topic, and then every day was a topic, and now every minute is a topic. And then we really discuss it at all the levels, on all the forums, almost nonstop, which is very good in a way, because it means that it preoccupies the people. It's just the messages that probably we do not do enough to put across that are also compensating or balancing the wrong messages. Education plays an important role. Without educating the new generation, you will fail people being able to accept or even to understand what migration brings. So education is very important. We can speak about migration. We do have nowadays master courses, PhDs on migration, and so on. Actually, it's going to be opening a master's course here in Belgrade very soon. So it's really important that the young generation get a grasp and have a well-informed decision whenever they state something or whenever they do something, because that's really pivotal. So it's not only from the news, but it's really because of the researches and information which is based on facts and not on myths, and based more on the realities. So education is really, really very important. Second, I would say that what we do today within Europe, building walls, will not stop migration, but what will do is increase the pockets of the smugglers and traffickers. The higher the wall, the more money they will get. And it's simple like that, and we also have to acknowledge that it's a fact of life. So without opening legal channels of migration, we will just increase the business for the smugglers and traffickers. So legal channels are important. And even more so for governments to acknowledge. They know, they realize, but they will never be able to acknowledge, because of political climates, that migrants are needed. We'll never be able to produce or the deficit that it's already in within the EU regarding the demographic figures. So migration, it can be part of the solution for the shortage of labor, not mentioning our own pension in whatever space of time. Maybe we won't have any without more children or more migrants, so we can decide which one to take. And last but not least is the root causes. It's all these movements of people, it's because we are not paying enough attention to the root causes. It can be crises which are maybe a bit difficult to counteract or to deal with, but the poverty, the investments, everything else. Can we bring, people follow jobs, so that's also a reality. Apart from crisis, the other big portion of people is those who are following jobs. We follow jobs also. I move in so many places all the time. It's something normal, it's inevitable. It's something that it happens and it will continue to happen. Can we at one point in time also think of putting the jobs where the people are? Maybe that can be a further solution there.
Kilian, you know the other side of the equation, as it were. You're intimately familiar with with the fate of refugees, with individual refugees. You were involved in the management of Zaatari, which I believe was, for a time, the biggest refugee camp in the world, the second biggest. There's this whole debate going on among migration experts about this reframing, Tina, that you also spoke about, of refugees, you know, not just being victims, not just being passive, sort of, you know, being pushed out by conflict, but actually being a resource for receiving societies. And then you have the other view that says, well, you know, regardless of whether somebody is economically active or can be a resource for receiving societies, if somebody has a right to international protection, we owe them international protection. Is that the tension that can be resolved? Is there an easy answer to this?
Yeah, I think it's a key, the narrative. And I will say something which is, I think, a bit a new storytelling. And the new storytelling is, when we talk about refugees, about migrants, we think about a good refugee, a good migrant is a returning migrant and is a returning refugee. But think about it. I mean, in history, when we all built out of displacement, a lot of this forced displacement, people were not forcibly returning. They moved on with their lives. And we have created, and I think somehow now being out of UNHCR for a certain time, the mantra of voluntary return as the preferred solution is blocking us from actually accepting that people move on. They change. Exile is changing people. Being in a new situation changes people. And I think we have created in our heads that blockage that only if everything goes wrong, people who have moved on will be locally integrated. It's the last solution in a way. It's the least preferred solution. So when people come to us, and Mrs. Merkel said the same thing to the arriving Syrians, when there is peace, and this is where I tend, by the way, to disagree, when there is peace, you will go back and you will rebuild your country. Yeah, of course many will go back, but don't tell them you don't check into our society. You tell them, as the Canadians do and many others have done in the past, you are with us, you stay with us. If you want to go back, you go back. You don't have to go back, but you're checking into our society. You're becoming a part of it. And I think this narrative, if we don't change it, we're going to be lost. So, and I've seen this in many places where always the temporariness of displacement is actually determining of how we deal with them. When I started in Jordan to look at Zati refugee camp as a city, which it will become, it has de facto become already after 5 years. Well, the Jordanians, they said, but they're going back, so why should there be a city? Most of the refugee camps I was involved, they still exist, and they were built in the early 90s and so on. So blocking people from moving on, blocking ourselves from putting in the right resources, change the arrival of new people into an opportunity is the way forward. Basically from crisis into opportunity, investing into infrastructure, into services, making many places which already have quite often a deficit in terms of investment and in terms of development, making them thriving communities. I see this currently in Greece, where we do a lot of work. I mean, kickstart the economy because you have more people. But here and again, when coming back to what Europe doesn't do, is serious investment. I mean, coming back to this monster Africa, where we're all screaming, nothing has changed, despite G20 summits and Marshall plans and so on. Nothing has changed in the villages. Nothing has changed in the slums. Nothing has changed in terms of investing in mega cities growing very badly and so on. Now, looking a little bit, you know that in Egypt, China is putting in 46 billion into the construction of a new capital city in a new Cairo. Where is this type of investment from the European Union? That is actually needed. I mean, a little bit of more. I mean, it's not money which is lacking in this world. It's in fact, sort of the boldness which we need to help other parts of the world to thrive. And it's not going to be a loss, it's going to be a worthwhile investment for all of us.
Rosa, just a quick comment.
Just a quick addition to that, because if you look at, yeah, it's working. Africa, the African continent, and certain countries in Africa are actually becoming countries of immigration. And that trend has been visible over the past few years. So actually helping them become countries of immigration by investing on their infrastructure is a long-term investment in the future, because if those countries break up, then we'll have massive influxes which we won't be able to deal with.
Before I open this up to the audience, to you as participants, I do want to ask Ahmet a question that's kind of sensitive. And it has to do with, we talked about values, European values. Do you think, if we look back at the migration debate in Western Europe, maybe in the Western world more generally, in the receiving countries over the last 20 years, it's shifted from a focus on structural exclusion, discrimination, labor market exclusion, and so on, education, towards a much more, it's taken a culturalist turn, hasn't it, where the focus today is much more on something that we tend to call integration, which is supposed to be a good thing. Now, in the Western European discourse, there seems to be a problem, a fundamental incompatibility that's posited between integration, which is good, and sort of immigrants hanging on, clinging on to their cultural background. And what I mean here very specifically, of course, is Islam and Muslims. We have Muslims being the largest single group in a lot of immigrants in a lot of Western European countries. The recent influx, of course, being a lot of people from Syria and Iraq and a few other places also was largely Muslim. You mentioned, I think it was you, the events in Cologne. Has this created perhaps a toxic mix that wasn't really there in this form before?
Well, the conditions are changing, generations are changing, the world is changing. But before I come to that, and I don't consider that a sensitive question, we have to address these issues. I mean, both in terms of perception as reality and in terms of making some objective analyses of the situation. Otherwise, stashing things out of sight, out of mind is not going to help any of us on this continent. But I just wanted to say something with regard to what Kilian said. What I totally agree with him when I mentioned that there will be a future, one hopes, for some of the migrants going back. I did not want to sound or did not intend to sound as that is a solution. But the notion, the other notion that in fact they are here and taking away jobs from us should be corrected in order also to put the reaction, the more right-wing reaction, on a more even keel. Now, with regard to this changing of attitudes in Europe, there is very little discussion about changing of attitudes in the Muslim world. And the Muslim world has had its stages of confrontation with the West. I mean, the terrible Turk, the Vienna, the Janissaries at the gate of Vienna, the Türkenfurst in Mitteleuropa, and all that. That was one. And then the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the rest of the Middle East, etc. Then the modernizing elite from the Middle East, be it the Ottomans, be it Egyptians, and elsewhere a little later. It was basically the modernizing elite basically said, look, you know, the defensive modernization was, in fact, that Europe had something, and in order to protect oneself from European domination, one had to learn from Europe, and that was the modernizing elite. And the modernizing elite was there, essentially, in Turkish modernization. In former colonial states, it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and so on and so forth. Not so decisive, but still the notion of an elite who would essentially see empiricism, science, and so on as the only way for the modernization. There is a massive reaction against this now. There is a totally massive reaction against this, and this, unfortunately, is also very much reinforced by us, if not right here, in intellectual centers not so far, in terms of relativism. Relativism has done more harm in sort of pushing this particularism as a valid democratic way, has done very much harm. But there is also a change in the Middle East, going back, in fact, to the containment policies of the West, where support for Islam was very good as an anti-communist measure. These various things coming together, along with a warped but very fast demographic change, namely a huge increase of population where greater and greater numbers and the percentages were not educated. In fact, they were educated in obscurantist ways. We are facing this now, partly our own fault, and partly what has happened there. And we see the reflection of this in the resident Muslim population. The first generation I mentioned, the Gastarbeiter, when they came here, they were from the mountains. They were not the mobile, contemporary Turkish workers who have enough money to hop on a plane and go anywhere and so on. But they basically, well, we're here to make money. We're here to do our best for our pockets. So that was a kind of integration. It was not cultural integration, but it was not a maladaptation to the environment. We have now a debate that is reinforced by people like Tariq Ramazan, who was given, shockingly enough, a chair at Oxford. I took time to read everything he wrote. He is basically saying in so many words, as the great intellectual ex cathedra talking from Oxford, say Muslims are different, but they will be in Europe. They are integrated in such a way as that they know exactly how to take advantage of the liberal constitutions and laws to keep their distance and difference. This is what we are facing now.
Tina wanted to say something very briefly, and then Rosa, and then I would like to collect questions. Sorry? All right.
Just to complement Ahmet's excellent points, integration is going to be a fascinating subject. Experts do predict that after the migration crisis, we will have an integration crisis. So we should all be prepared to discuss about it. And what we are saying is that integration is a two-way street. So it's not only really the migrants or the refugees to integrate, but also the societies to be ready to integrate them. And what we are emphasizing most of the time is integrating the migrant, the refugee, and not really taking the same attention towards the societies, how they will be enabled to integrate the migrants or the refugees. And my last point is about the successful integration. We generally speak about a successful integration when the person speaks the language, when the person gets a job, and when the person starts paying taxes to the government, then it's fully, fantastically, and successfully integrating. And what we omit to observe is that person, when he or she goes home, is not going to the national society, but it's going within the own diaspora or within the own nationalities. We can see that in Turkey. It's successful integration to the extent that they will always prefer to be within their own group. So that's not really successful. Thank you.
I don't think we lack topics to discuss tonight. We got about half an hour for further questions, comments from the audience. I'd like to invite you to be succinct. If you have a question to a particular panelist, please make that clear. And please introduce yourself when you ask your question or make your comment. I saw a hand go up over there.
Hello, thank you very much. It was very interesting. My name is Stefanie Fenkert. I'm from Austria, director of the International Institute for Peace. And I have a question concerning the notion values. Because I think since 2 or 3 years, wherever I go, even if we're dealing with security or whatever else, we talk about European values. And I would say, if you put together like a person from Poland, a person from Portugal, a person from Denmark or Austria and Italy together on a table and ask them, what are European values? I'm pretty sure we are getting very, very mixed results. Why am I addressing this? Because I think we would have instruments which are a lot deeper and which would give us more commitment, because we have actually noted them all down in documents. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just to note one, and also we have the covenants, and we have different regional whatever. And these human rights actually gives us also claims and responsibilities and values. You cannot claim a value. And I just would like, what is your opinion on those whole value debate? And maybe another point which I would like to make is about changing the narrative, because I think it's very interesting that we still talk about refugee influx in Europe and wherever, where, at least to my information, I think none of the 10 most receiving countries, none of them is actually in Europe, because they are on the outside. And we had a conference in Uganda, which is a post-conflict country, and they have an influx from 1.5 million South Sudanese refugees. So just about changing narratives, and yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I'd suggest we take a couple more questions. Down here.
Hi there, Kurt Bassiner, Democratization Policy Council. I wanted to follow up on that point, but coming to the data that you'd collected, Rosa, because all of you talked about this issue, but I think you have the clearest sort of snapshot of what you said there was a majority inclined against immigration, but it was a qualified majority, and I'm sure it depended on how the question was asked. But we've seen, as an American citizen, that very vocal minorities can be dominant. That's what we have, unfortunately, right now, of roughly a third of our population. Do you see, so you have a proto-constituency for more openness, more welcoming integration, and articulation of values. It can be amorphous. They need to be articulated and promoted. Could you expand on that? And what does the data show you about what unifies this more open group, and how that might be activated to be politically potent to change the narrative?
Anyone else want to jump in at this point, or should we go to our panelists? I think it's the latter, huh? Do you want to get started, Rosa?
Okay. I mean, the data I've been looking at is Eurobarometer and European Social Survey. Those are the ones that fairly clearly pointed to this conclusion that actually attitudes haven't changed that much. So there's quite a lot of continuity, and it's an attitudinal question about favorability or less to immigration. There are countries, some countries are very favorable, and actually that's the European piece of it. And I think it's one factor explaining why the crisis, the political crisis that occurred in Europe following the refugee influx happened that way. And that is that you have some countries which are very favorable to immigration, Sweden being top of the list, and that you have a number of countries which are very, very unfavorable, with 80% of the population being against immigration. And I don't think I need to name names here. I mean, we know who they are. But these, and that created a big blocking minority at the level of the European Council, and created or contributed to creating the political crisis in Europe. Whether this data is correlated to, I mean, there are other issues that are a bit more, it's difficult to correlate the attitudes to immigration to other attitudes. For instance, on globalization, there still is polarization, but it doesn't follow, you don't get the same data. You get 45% in favor of globalization, 55% against. It's not the same. It's more in sort of 60-something versus 30-something on immigration. So that doesn't collate. But I think the demography is giving a picture that the younger people are more open, more cosmopolitan, and more pro-European. So there is quite a lot of data suggesting that. There is one point in the research, the data that I've looked at, where there are some contradictions, and that is well, there are two things actually. One is that there's quite a bit of dissatisfaction with the EU dealing with certain issues and preferring the national government. But again, it's not clear why. For instance, 60% of Germany is an export-driven country which makes pots of money worldwide. 60% of Germans are anti-trade, and yes, high percentages, and they would want to take trade powers away from the EU back to the national governments. So this data is like, where does this sit with everything else? I'm not sure. And there are a number of polls that come out with this kind of contradictory data. And the other thing that we can't, hasn't been monitored over the years is whether people become more conservative with age. So whether it's just a question of younger people being more open. And I think that is really important, because if it is that, if people remain more open and more cosmopolitan, then there will be attitudinal change over time. But if instead the pattern is that people become more conservative, it isn't. There's plenty of other data to suggest. Some of it is, I mean, the advantage of Eurobarometer and ESS, the social survey, is that it's pan-European. And there are very few which ask the same questions in different countries. But there's plenty of evidence suggesting that in rural areas, in areas where there's no immigration, people are less open, less charitable, et cetera, whereas people in urban areas, more exposed with higher education, and education is a big, big cleavage on openness or closure towards the rest, the outside, the other. So there is that, the sort of the education and rural, and exposure actually to immigration is a key determinant in making people more open to it.
Right. Do you want to, Ahmet, maybe speak to the value question that was asked?
Yes, well, thank you for that question. I think you're right on target. The thing is that we lack the vocabulary, so I used it as a shorthand in European values. And of course, what are European values? One of the points that I made that, in fact, there are a set of values that are common to Europe and believe that they're common to Europe, and then there are differentiated reactions to immigrants and so on, and all of a sudden we say again a shorthand nationalism, but there is an intermediate stage there that in fact there are different reactions from different regions and different nations to the kind or the perception of threat from immigrants. So consequently, there is a differentiation in the outlook. Therefore, there is a centrifugal effect with regard to rise of particularisms in Europe as well. So one cannot really talk about European values, but some common values that we partly observe and as reality here, and partly it is a perception and a myth that continues. But there is no vocabulary. Do we mean secular values? That opens up another debate there. Then you have a comparison of Bavaria with France, and then you don't get anywhere. If you say secular values, that is that kind of problem. Where perhaps we are really talking about a set of value-free or at least confession-free values in Europe, such as that no preferences of a group should be imposed or can be expected anymore in Europe to be imposed on society in such a way as to restrict individual liberties. Well, if I were to use that kind of a tentative definition for one word, I would have to give an entire essay on the subject, and that is the problem. But there is a difference between that, which we're trying to define in a way that it is not crystal clear, because people do have, regions have values and so on and so forth. But that, when you compare that to almost a tribal kind of undifferentiated values that you have to subscribe to because of the accepted confessional or accepted religion, then it is very, very different. So this is essentially a differentiated society that has the protection of negative liberties has become a part of DNA. And there are other places where negative liberties are frowned upon. This is essentially what I meant by European values.
But it is interesting, though, isn't it, how these things seem to be coded by, I don't necessarily want to say racially coded, but perhaps coded by minority versus majority. I mean, I am never asked, I've been an immigrant for 22 years of my 46 years on this earth, and nobody has ever asked me to integrate. If I hold anti-gay views, which I don't, this would be put down, this would be attributed to me being an idiot. Whereas if I were Muslim and I were to hold anti-gay views, it would be seen as culturally determined, religiously determined. There is a bit of a disconnect there, isn't there, in the debate? Not just in the debate, but also in the way values and notions such as integration are brought to bear on political reality. I mean, in the way policy is made.
Yeah.
That wasn't really a question, I guess.
Well, no, but I mean, let me say one thing though. I mean, in all of these things, when we say Muslims not have more difficulty integrating, we are really talking about very visible Muslim communities, and there are probably more invisible Muslims in Europe who are denizens of pubs and things like that, but you don't notice them. Therefore, what you are really pointing to is a kind of group that basically wants to be different, and that has become more and more visible in terms of the clash. I mean, before this migration business was whole waves of terrorism. You remember London 2005 and so on and so forth. Well, these are big shocks in the system, and it is essentially there are some terrorist activities for reasons of confessional differences rather than terrorist activities to, let's say, gain independence for a piece of land. We tend to understand that. We tend not to understand the other.
Yeah. But before I give the word to Kilian and then Tina, I also just another facet. I mean, I look at the place in downtown Brussels where I live, where on the one hand you have a big Moroccan community where radicalization is a problem, and not just radicalization sort of in a generic sense, but also, you know, that has served as a base camp, as it were, for terrorist activity. On the other side is a sizable Turkish community, equally Muslim, if you simply go by religion, where radicalization just hasn't been a problem, at least not anywhere near the extent to which it is in the Moroccan community, which would suggest that perhaps looking at this issue as Muslim versus non-Muslim might not be the best way to go about. That's just a facet. But Kilian, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think it's, again, important to differentiate between issues, and Tina said that the integration crisis, or whatever we can call it, we're mixing up migration with many, many other issues. And I think it is absolutely critical that also European politicians, our politicians, take on another storytelling again. Migration is us. Migration, we are made out of migration, there will be migration, and so on. So we shouldn't be questioning this. Other issues such as radicalization, such as intercultural relationships, you name it, these are totally different issues. And I think we should elevate the theme of people on the move in all its facets, because I'm honestly increasingly against this sort of putting in stamps on people, you're this, you're that, and so on. But anyway, people on the move is an issue which is as important as environment, for instance. And I liked very much recently, there was an event with Arnold Schwarzenegger where he stood in the Hofburg in Vienna, and he said, I'm a conservative politician speaking in front of a green president and a red chancellor, and we all believe in the same thing, and that is protecting the environment. Then he talked about somebody else in DC who doesn't believe in that, but anyway, so he said we all believe in the same thing, there is a need to work on the environment. So in the same way, we need to create a real coalition on understanding migration needs to be managed. You don't prevent migration. Are we crazy to talk about prevention of migration, as certain politicians doing currently? And I find that very dangerous to put that on the same level. And I think that this is really absolutely not necessary, that it's being brought, again, back to what I call the European original project. And that understanding, it's not just about nation states which happen to have a coalition of the like-minded when it comes to economics.
I mean, an easy answer, perhaps a facile answer to, or facetious answer to the question about European values would be to enumerate Article 2 of the Lisbon Treaty, which lists those values. And it has things like, you know, then we could ask the question whether the Norwegians and the Swiss and the Serbs believe in those because they're not in the EU. It lists things such as non-discrimination, solidarity, I believe. What's in Article 2? Equality between men and women. Very interesting. I mean, I'm Swiss. Swiss women got the vote at federal level the year I was born, which tells you that I'm very old, but it also tells you that, you know, it's within a lifetime. So, I mean, those things are, on the one hand, very changeable. They change in reaction to sort of atmosphere and moods, I suppose. But on the other hand, we also do have, I mean, there are legal texts that sort of enshrine. It's not just an abstract discussion about values. Tina, you wanted to say something about values, integration, Muslims, Moroccans.
Reflecting a little bit on the questions also, but also what has been said, I agree with Kilian on the difference between prevention and manage migration is huge. And you will all agree with me that you can lose many votes by using manage instead of prevention. So it's something that most probably our politicians do know. So in the campaign period, they will always say prevent instead of manage. However, what in the long term they don't think about is that today's migrant is going to be tomorrow's voter. So it's something for us to still hope for a brighter future. Reflecting a little bit on the narrative and on the data, it's wonderful how you can play with it. So it's 242 million migrants in the world. It's really a huge number. Yes, everyone is saying. In fact, it's much higher than ever before. Yes, everyone was saying. In 90s, we had only 191 million. Oh, how wonderful. But in fact, if you look at the total population, in the 90s, 2.8%, and now it's 3.1%. So it's not at all a huge difference, or not at all a huge increase, but really depends how you put it in the narrative. Exactly as you were saying. South-South migration, it's huge. It's 36-38% of the total migration. So if you think about it, it's really something that we are claiming here in Europe as we deal with so much, but there it's even higher than here, in addition to them being also a source. So of course they are a source as well as a host, if you wish. They are hosting a high number of migrants and refugees, much higher than we do host here. The other topic on figures, just as a point of interest, is feminization of migration. Is no feminization of migration whatsoever. It's 48%, which is actually lower than in 2000 when it was 51%, or in 63 when it was 47%. So it's no feminization. It's just a nice word to use if you really want to influence on the gender issue discussion. Turkey hosting 3.2 million migrants. I mean, our 1 million coming through Europe, it shouldn't be a big deal. Kenya, Jordan, I'm certain Kilian will have more to say to that, or Pakistan, Iran. For that sake, today, Bangladesh. Who speaks about Bangladesh? We do not speak about their generosity to receive so many of Rohingya there. And my last point is about the values, a little bit to reflect about that, and to give a little hope for all of us. One of my professors were telling me when I was really down doing humanitarian aid, saying that, look, Tina, we may not be able to change the world, but you are able to change the whole world for an individual. And I think that's something, a value for all of us to bring with us after this evening, maybe. Thank you.
There was a question in the back, Stephen.
Thank you. Stephen Blockman, CEPS. Rosa, you mentioned that there's much more activity on the EU external front rather than in forging a common asylum system within the European Union politics. On the external front, the Dutch government in its new coalition agreement said that it's willing to seek or to support the idea of replicating EU-Turkey deals with other countries. Is that a good idea to the whole panel? And second idea, muddying the water is a little bit on prevention of migration. Do you use in the external field also engaged in the negotiation of migration compacts with West African states primarily, Sahel? What does the panel think about the redistribution of development aid going to these countries to border control of these third states?
Let's take one last question in the back, and then I think that's an excellent way for us to wrap up the panel. Please.
Hi, Marcin Brzański from the Pulaski Foundation. Thank you very much for all your comments. Following up a little bit on the question to add on the external front, I'd like to hear comments from you and ideas. How does that link with actually actors who want to muddle the waters around it? And I'm thinking, for instance, about Russia, who benefits from Europe being, really, really not integrated on this issue and having problems around its borders. And that's one part. The second part relates to Turkey and the policy towards Turkey. We're talking about the deal with Turkey, but is that going to actually hold, or might it not be in the benefit of the new Turkey foreign policy that it doesn't hold together in the future? And a very, very quick comment. In terms of the title of the session, it's about values or management. Well, it is ultimately a crisis of leadership, because in terms of political leadership, the benefits of sustaining a short-term policy of fear-mongering among the policies are just too big. What are your thoughts of that to change? I haven't yet heard one of these. Thanks very much.
I'd suggest we go in the same order in which we started. So Tina, maybe?
Yeah. With the external border, you may know that there are attempts to establish hotspots not only within Europe, but now within more external, in particular in African countries, Libya and so on. One part would say that we in Europe, we just want to push the problem further away. So instead of we dealing with it, we ask others to deal with it. We experts, we say that we are saving lives, because if you really are a person with rights for asylum, that you should get that without crossing a sea in a sinking boat and eventually pass away through that road. So that's about the external dimension. That for the time being there are many questions about it. I think that until we try it out, it's very difficult to say what is going to be really the benefit, the added value, or the results with it. The EU-Turkey statement, we were very skeptical about it from the day one when it has been announced. But it's already a couple of good months that since has been announced, and it's still holding. I know that it has a cost and so on and so forth, but let's be optimistic in that regard.
On the hotspots, I think we just need to look at the hotspots we have in Europe itself to be, I don't think we have been shining and doing anything, talking about Greece and Italy. Have we managed to distribute anybody in a significant number? No, we haven't. So, if somebody says we will be taking people in greater numbers from somewhere in Chad or in Niger or so, that's a joke. I think it's a really, really a cheap excuse to push the problem very far away. What we don't see doesn't make us hot, as we say in German. The whole hoo-ha about the Mediterranean itself, it's just the tip of the iceberg we see of people on the move. The real things are happening inside of the desert and wherever else, exploitation and so on and so forth. We are very good in trying to hide the problem. We are also very good in pretending that we're doing something somewhere else, and if you look in the ground with all the efforts by the agencies doing something there, and with all due respect, the scale of it is ridiculous. And so again, coming also to the question on aid and linking and tying this up to aid, honestly, what is aid? aid is a joke in absolute money terms globally as we speak. It's 25 billion and it's going down for humanitarian aid, and it's 200 billion for development aid. China is putting 960 billion into the Silk Road. Now we're talking. And so on and so forth. I mean, so we are playing around with a relatively minimal, ridiculous amount of money, where we time conditions and so on, and you take our people back. So I think unless we're becoming real about investment, social investment, impact investment, real investment in fragile environments, I mean, I think this is all just trying to satisfy voters somewhere and trying to calm people. Again, the absolute numbers we're talking about, south-south migration is much more important than what we're seeing coming across. The numbers, if you look at it, what the number of people who have come into Italy is twice the number of people fitting into the Wembley Stadium, for God's sake. I mean, and that makes Europe shake. Sometimes I get to a point where I suspect there is really a sort of a bad will. We want to make it to a problem so that we can absolutely shut down. I mean, also coming back to the points previously, I mean, with UNHCR, we have at the time and the agencies working on dealing with people registration and documentation. We have registered in the middle of the most impossible environments hundreds of thousands of people, and Europe can't do that in Passau in the middle of Germany? I mean, excuse me. So I think there is a lot we have to be much more honest about it and really change it, moving back and saying, well, who are we to talk about this? We need to become serious and be investing in a different way there where it really matters.
Ahmet, some concluding thoughts?
Just a word again on the EU-Turkey deal. I think there's an Amnesty report called A Blueprint for Despair. I think that's a very good roundup of that. The numbers of migrants have fallen, but not because of that deal, because of other developments. But the existing population, Syrian and others, but particularly the Syrian population in Turkey, their lot has not changed, and it is likely to get a little worse when the labor market contracts in Turkey in the near future. So it is not a very optimistic prediction.
Okay, I wasn't very good at keeping notes of the questions, but just to say, I agree with everything that has been said so far. I think maybe I'll just add a couple of points. In my view, so long as the ultimate goal of migration compacts is to keep people where they are, then that's doomed for failure, because it's in human history to move. And we heard the statistics, it's about 3%, and it's been like this for a long time, and it's going to continue to be like this. So to try and keep people there, if that is the aim of the migration compact, it's not going to work. Whereas, and I think I said that earlier, what would be needed is different kinds of partnerships where one talks with partners about the big issues, climate change, environmental degradation, urbanization, demography, etc. There's one thing I didn't mention, and that is I believe that the EU needs to beef up its conflict prevention capabilities, and not just prevention actually, and conflict management capabilities, so that it can actually shape the next big international conflicts that will come and not be just an observer as it was in the case of Syria. I think that should be part and package of it. So, you know, one line of policy is about managing regular or irregular migration, but the normal migration, shall we say, and the other is about managing large-scale displacement of people because of conflict, because of authoritarianism, etc. So there are paths that can be followed. A word on Russia. Russia's population is shrinking. and many of the countries that are most hostile to immigration have shrinking populations. And they claim that their hostility towards migration is to retain their values and culture, etc., but there's not going to be much of one if they do not have people, if they don't have children. Even Japan, which has been a mono-ethnic country with the exception of the Koreans, is actually beginning to open up. So I really think that these issues, some countries really need to rethink their policies rather than, in the case of Russia, be pleased that Europe is showing all its weaknesses when a few people show up at the doorstep. I'm not sure I've covered everything, but I think I'll leave it there.
I always get the feeling when one talks about migration that we've barely scratched the surface, but as it were, we're out of time. So I would like to thank our panelists for a very engaging debate, our terrific audience for asking very pointed questions, and wish you all a good night, and see you tomorrow.